Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also, if you have a scary story, share it with us down in the comments. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. I was a park ranger, patrolling the grounds as part of my overnight shift. The park was deserted, the only signs of life the occasional nocturnal animals scurrying through the underbrush. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting light on the empty pathways and silent trees. I was making my way towards the playground when I noticed something peculiar. The swings, usually still and quiet, were moving. The chains creaked softly as the seat swayed back and forth, as if propelled by an invisible force. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to shake off the sudden chill. Must have been the wind, I thought, though the air was calm and not a leaf stirred. I approached the swings, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The motion seemed to slow as I drew near, the seat settling into a gentle swing. I reached out, my hand grasping the chain, and with a firm tug, I brought the swing to a halt. The sudden silence was almost deafening, and I stood there for a moment just to make sure everything was fine. As I turned to leave, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. It was the softest, most childish plea for a push. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I scanned the area, but the only things moving were the shadows cast by my flashlight. There was no child, no one in sight. I told myself to ignore it, to keep walking, but my feet wouldn't move. The playground was eerily quiet, and the swings now still seemed to watch me. I forced myself to take a step, then another, my eyes darting from side to side. The whisper came again, this time so quiet I almost missed it. The request for a push. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping the area, but there was nothing. Just the empty swings, swaying slightly as if they were mocking me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get back to the ranger station, to the safety of the warm, well-lit building. But the playground seemed to stretch out endlessly, each step taking me further into the darkness. The whisper followed me, a persistent, unwelcome companion. Each time it came, it was a little clearer, a little more insistent. When I finally reached the swing set again, the whispers stopped. The swings were still, perfectly motionless. I took a deep breath, willing myself to calm down. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But as I reached for the chain to check if it was secure, the swing began to move on its own. The chains creaked, the seat swayed, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was a hidden wind tunnel or some trick of the terrain. But the park was as still as a tomb, and the only sounds were my ragged breathing and the eerie creaking of the swing. I backed away, my eyes glued to the moving seat. It continued to swing, the motion steady and rhythmic, as if a child were sitting there, invisible to my eyes. I ran, my legs carrying me away from the playground as fast as they could. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. The whisper returned, trailing after me like a ghost in the night. I reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I turned on all the lights, the brightness a stark contrast to the darkness outside. I tried to shake off the fear, to tell myself it was just the night playing tricks on me. But the whispers lingered, echoing in my mind. I sat at my desk, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on the paperwork in front of me. The sound of the swings creaking haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. As the night wore on, the whispers grew fainter until they were just a distant memory. But I never went back to that playground again. The swings moved that night, and I know I wasn't imagining it. The park was never the same after that, and neither was I. I was working my usual shift as a night janitor in one of the countless office buildings that tower over the city. The building was mostly quiet, the only sounds my footsteps echoing through the empty halls and the occasional creak of the old ventilation system. The clock in the lobby read just past midnight, and I had a lot of floors to clean before the morning crew arrived. I was on the 10th floor, pushing my mop through the main office area when I noticed the door to the private restroom was shut. This was odd. As I checked earlier and it was wide open, I paused, listening. The usual silence of the night shift was disturbed by a faint sound, a toilet flushing. My heart skipped a beat. The restroom was locked, and only a few select people had keys. No one should be in there. I set down my mop and approached the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Someone must have stayed late and locked themselves in by mistake, or maybe one of the executives had come back to finish some work and forgotten to log out. I knocked once, twice. The sound was hollow and there was no response. I waited, but the silence stretched on, unbroken. After a moment, I decided to wait. Maybe they were just taking a long break. I leant against the wall, my eyes fixed on the door. Minutes ticked by, and the silence grew more oppressive. I checked my watch. Nearly 10 minutes had passed. No one had come out. The building felt more isolated, the quiet more intense. Curiosity and a growing sense of nervousness pushed me to try the door again. I rummaged through my set of keys and found the one for the private restroom. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating the pristine, empty interior. There was no one there. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the mirrors, the stalls, the sinks. Everything was in place, not a single thing out of order. I checked the stalls, but they were all vacant. The toilet in the corner had a damp ring around the bowl, as if someone had just flushed it, but no water was running. The taps were dry, the floor spotless. I left the restroom, locking the door behind me. The building felt different now, the walls closing in, the air colder. I finished my work, my mind preoccupied with the strange occurrence. I packed up my things and headed for the exit, the door of the private restroom lingering in my thoughts. As I stepped out into the night, the city seemed louder, more alive, but the memory of that empty restroom refused to fade. I walked home, the sound of the toilet flush echoing in my mind. I knew I shouldn't have, but I looked back at the building one last time. The windows on this 10th floor were dark, and the door to the private restroom was just another locked door in the vast, silent structure. I didn't go back to that building again. They never found out who had flushed the toilet that night, but I knew, deep down, that something was watching, waiting, and it was still there in the shadows of the 10th floor. My shift was just beginning, and the silence pressed heavily against my ears. The building was supposed to be empty, everyone gone for the weekend, but I'd had an odd feeling all day, a sense that something was amiss. I shook it off, attributing it to the late hour and the quiet of the deserted floors. The usual routine was to check each level, make sure all the doors were locked and everything was in order. I started on the ground floor, my footsteps echoing softly in the vast empty space. The halls were lined with identical doors, each marked with a plaque bearing the names of long-gone employees. I moved methodically, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corridors. Everything seemed normal, but the quiet was too deep, too complete. Reaching the elevator, I pressed the button for the 4th floor, where the executives had their offices. The ride up was swift, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. The corridor here was different, lined with plush carpet and high-polished wood. I had a keycard for the main door, but beyond that, the offices were locked, each one secure and impenetrable. As I approached the door, a faint noise caught my attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, repetitive sound, like the tapping of fingers on a keyboard. I frowned, pausing. The offices were always silent at this hour. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but the noise persisted, growing more distinct. I swiped my card and pushed through the main door, the sound of my shoes muffled by the thick carpet. The noise was coming from the far end of the corridor, behind one of the executive doors. My heart began to race as I approached, the door marked with the name of the CEO, who was out of town for a conference. The door was locked, as it should be. I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling slightly. Finally the lock clicked, and I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The office was a spacious, well-appointed room, a large desk dominating the center. The noise was louder here, the tapping of keys unmistakable. I scanned the room, my beam settling on the computer. The monitor was dark, the screen a blank slate, but the chair, the CEO's expensive leather chair, was turning, a slow, steady rotation, as if someone had just stood up and left the desk. I inched forward, my eyes fixed on the chair. The tapping continued, but there was no one in the room. I reached the desk and touched the keyboard, the keys cold and unyielding. The chair stopped its rotation, facing me as if it had turned to greet me. The tapping ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. I spun the chair around, half expecting to find something, but it was empty, just as it should be. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was the building's ventilation system, or a loose wire. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I left the office, locking the door behind me. The corridor was just as it had been, the plush carpet and polished wood walls offering no answers. I finished my patrol, the noise from the CEO's office lingering in my mind, a phantom rhythm that I couldn't shake. When I returned to the lobby, I glanced up at the security cameras, half expecting to see something, anything out of the ordinary. The screens showed empty, static-filled images, each one a blank testament to the night's strangeness. I logged out of the system, my hands shaking as I typed the final commands. I left the building, the night air a welcome relief. I didn't look back, but as I walked away I could feel the weight of the dark, empty office, the spinning chair and the unexplained tapping following me like a cold, unseen shadow. The night was long, and the only company I had was scrolling on my mobile. I was a night shift clerk at a lonely gas station on the outskirts of a small town in America, the kind of place where cars would rarely stop, and when they did, it was usually because they had no other choice. Around 2 in the morning, the door creaked open and a man walked in. He was tall, with sunken eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in days. His skin was pale, almost grey, and his clothes were rumpled, as if he had been on the road for far too long. He moved with a stiffness that seemed to speak of exhaustion rather than age. He walked straight to the coffee machine, filled a cup, and then came to the counter, placing a few crumpled bills on the surface. I handed him his change and watched as he left, the door closing with a soft click behind him. I didn't think much of it, just another tired soul on a long journey. But a few hours later, around 5 in the morning, the door creaked open again, and there he was. The same man wearing the same rumpled clothes, his eyes still heavy with fatigue. He walked to the coffee machine, filled a cup, and then approached the counter, placing the same crumpled bills on the surface. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at him, my mind racing. How could he be here again? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. But before I could question it, he was gone, the door closing behind him just as it had the first time. Shaken, I decided to check the security footage. I played back the tapes, my eyes scanning the images. The first time, the man appeared, just as I remembered, but when I looked for the second visit, it was like he had vanished into thin air. The footage showed nothing, no sign of him ever returning. I rewound and replayed the tape, but the results were the same. It was as if he had never been there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a glitch in the system. Maybe the cameras had malfunctioned for a few minutes, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. The man was real. I had served him, and yet there was no evidence of his second visit. The rest of my shift was a blur. I couldn't focus, my mind constantly drifting back to the man and the eerie feeling he left behind. When my shift finally ended, I left the gas station, my steps quickening as I walked to my car. I glanced back, half expecting to see him standing there, but the station was empty, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign above the pumps. As I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder, was he a figment of my imagination? Or was there something more sinister at play? The thought lingered in the back of my mind, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. When I finally reached my house, I turned off the engine and sat in the darkness, the image of the man's pale face haunting me. I never saw him again, but I never forgot him either. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can almost hear the rustle of his clothes and the soft click of the gas station door. I was on the late shift at the gas station, a quiet job that suited me just fine. The occasional trucker or night owl would pull in, and I'd go through the motions, getting through the hours until dawn. It was a routine I could handle, a steady stream of boredom with the odd spike of human contact. At around 2 in the morning, a familiar car rolled into the forecourt. It was a beat-up old Ford, the type that looked like it had seen better days. The regular, a man with a haggard face and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, always came in at this hour. I'd never got to know him much, just exchanged a few nods and words as he paid for his fuel. But tonight, something was different. The car stopped, and the engine idled, but the man never came inside. I leaned against the counter, watching the clock tick by. Minutes stretched, and the car remained stationary. The neon lights above flickered, casting everything in a sickly green hue. My mind wandered, thinking about the day's trivialities, but a nagging sense kept dragging me back to the Ford. It shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Finally, with a sigh, I decided to check on him. Maybe he'd fallen asleep or forgotten his wallet. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The car was still there, its engine rumbling softly in the silence. I approached, my boots crunching on the gravel. The windows were fogged up, but I could see the man's silhouette slumped over the steering wheel. My heart thudded as I reached the driver's side. I tapped on the window, but there was no response. I tried the door, and it swung open without a sound. The interior was cold, the air heavy with the scent of fuel and something metallic. The man was gone, but his seat was drenched in a dark, sticky substance. I recoiled, the smell hitting me hard. Blood. Panicked, I spun around, my eyes scanning the area. There was a faint trail of mud leading away from the car and into the woods. The trees loomed, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. For a moment I considered calling for help, but the thought of the police taking forever to arrive left me uneasy. I had to do something, anything. I followed the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The mud was fresh, as if something heavy had dragged itself through the underbrush. My breath came in short bursts, and I kept my flashlight beam steady, afraid to see what it might reveal. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual night sounds muted by an unnatural stillness. After what felt like an eternity, the trail ended at the base of a large oak tree. The ground was churned up, as if a struggle had taken place. I knelt, my fingers tracing the mud. It was mixed with something dark and viscous, the same substance that had drenched the car seat. My hands trembled as I stood, the reality of the situation sinking in. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run back to the safety of the gas station, but the other part, the more stubborn part, refused to leave. I needed to find out what had happened to the man. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods were thick and the beam barely cut through the foliage. I took a deep breath and ventured deeper. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The air was damp and the ground squelched under my feet. My mind raced, conjuring images of what could have taken the man. A wild animal, a lunatic, something worse. I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the trail, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I stumbled upon a clearing, the ground covered in a carpet of dead leaves. In the center there was a large, indistinct shape, partially hidden by the foliage. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the object. It was a massive stone, its surface etched with symbols I couldn't understand. The air around it felt colder, as if it sucked the warmth from everything nearby. I stepped closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. The symbols on the stone were crude, almost primitive. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the lines flickering in and out of focus. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the surface. The stone was cold, as if it had been frozen solid. A shiver ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand back. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground. It was a small, leather-bound book, half buried in the leaves. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded. I flipped through, and the contents made my blood run cold. It was a diary filled with entries that spoke of strange rituals and dark entities. I stuffed the book into my jacket and hurried back to the gas station. The relief of seeing the familiar lights was overwhelming. I rushed inside, my mind racing with possibilities. I needed to make sense of what I'd found, but first I had to check the CCTV footage. I pulled up the security feed, my hands fumbling with the controls. The screen flickered to life, showing the usual view of the forecourt. But as I rewound to the time the man had arrived, the image began to distort. Static lines raced across the screen and the image blurred. I tried to adjust the settings, but nothing worked. The screen remained a chaotic mess of white noise. Frustrated and scared, I decided to call the police. I dialed the number, my heart thudding in my chest. When they finally arrived, I showed them the abandoned car and the blood on the seat. I pointed out the trail of mud, but my words felt hollow. The police searched the area, but they found nothing. No sign of struggle, no trace of the man. They asked me a few questions, but I could barely form coherent sentences. They left, promising to follow up, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The diary weighed heavily in my jacket, its contents gnawing at my mind. I went back to the clearing, determined to understand what had happened. The stone was still there, the symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. I opened the diary, my hands trembling as I read the final entry. It spoke of an ancient ritual, a way to summon something from the depths of the woods. The man had been part of a group, a cult of sorts, seeking to bring darkness into the world. The symbols on the stone were a key, a way to open the gates. The mud and blood were signs of the sacrifice, a price paid for something unspeakable. I slammed the diary shut, my mind reeling. I had to get out of there, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The air grew colder and the symbols on the stone pulsed more urgently. I forced myself to turn and run, my heart pounding in my chest. Back at the gas station, I locked the doors and turned off the lights. I sat in the dark, the diary clutched in my hands. The words swam before my eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The CCTV screen remained blank, a constant reminder of the night's events. As the first light of dawn began to break, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The horror of the night had left me drained, but I knew I couldn't stay. I gathered my things and left the gas station, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights fading behind me. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. The road stretched out before me, the world slowly coming to life, but the silence of the night lingered, a dark cloud that refused to lift. I knew I'd never forget what I'd seen, the symbols on the stone, the blood in the car, the blank screen. The woods were still out there, and I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets they held. I drove away, the diary tucked safely in my jacket. I didn't know what to do with it, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It was a piece of the puzzle, a key to understanding something that defied explanation. The Ford remained in the forecourt, a silent witness to the night's events. I never returned to that gas station, and I never found out what happened to the man. The town continued on, oblivious to the horrors that lurked in the shadows, but I knew. I knew that some things were better left undisturbed, some secrets better left buried. The woods were a place of darkness, a place where the lines between the natural and the supernatural blurred, and I was the only one who knew the truth. The road ahead was long, but I didn't dare look back. The night had changed me, and I knew I could never go back to the way things were. The diary and the stone were a part of me now, a constant reminder of the darkness that existed just beyond the reach of the everyday world. I drove on, the silence of the car a comforting sound, but the memory of the night haunted me, a dark shadow that would never fully disappear. The diner was my usual graveyard shift haunt, a place where the night seemed to drag on forever, and the silence was only broken by the occasional late-night trucker or college student on a caffeine bender. But that night everything changed. I was serving a couple who had just ordered a round of coffee and a stack of pancakes when the lights flickered and then plunged into darkness. The sudden absence of light was disorienting, and I stumbled, my hand brushing against the warm surface of a coffee cup. The hum of the refrigerators and the soft murmur of the air conditioning ceased, leaving me in a void of complete stillness. I fumbled for my mobile phone, but the screen remained blank, as lifeless as the surroundings. Panic surged through me, but I tried to maintain my composure. I called out into the darkness, my voice echoing off the tiled walls, but there was no response. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, a constant reminder that the world beyond the diner continued to exist, even if my immediate reality had been turned upside down. I made my way to the counter, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet that lined the aisle. The till was still open, and the cash inside gleamed faintly in the dim emergency lighting that had kicked in. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The diner was eerily quiet, and the rows of empty booths seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one a silent witness to the strange turn of events. I decided to check the kitchen, hoping to find my colleagues. But as I pushed open the swinging door, I was greeted by an equally deserted space. The stove was cold, and the prep area was spotless, as if the cooks had vanished mid-task. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the lack of warmth in the diner. I called out again, my voice trembling, but the silence was absolute. I returned to the main area, the flashlight beam dancing across the tables and chairs. The couple who had been sitting at booth 4 was gone, but their unfinished coffee and pancake were still there, steam rising from the surfaces. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of anyone else. The diner was empty, a surreal tableau of a moment frozen in time. I tried the door, but it was locked, as if the diner had somehow sealed itself off from the outside world. I jiggled the handle, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The door remained stubbornly shut, and a sense of dread settled over me. I checked the phone again, but the screen was still blank, and the lines were dead. I was trapped, alone in the dark. The lights flickered back to life, casting an uneasy glow over the diner. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the sudden change. The diner looked the same, but something was different. The weight of the silence was oppressive, and the air felt charged with an invisible current. I checked the till again, and the cash was still there, but the sense of unease only deepened. I moved to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the outside world, but the streets were empty, and the neon signs of the neighbouring businesses flickered weakly. I turned back to the diner, my mind racing. What had happened? Where had everyone gone? I tried to call out, but the words died in my throat. The diner was a tomb, and I was its only inhabitant. The lights flickered again, and I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I should run, but the door was locked, and the phone was dead. I was trapped, and the fear was gnawing at me, a relentless beast that refused to be tamed. The lights went out once more, and I was plunged back into the darkness. I screamed, the sound echoing through the diner, but there was no response. No one came to help me, no one to tell me what was happening. Then, just as suddenly, the lights came back on. I spun around, the flashlight beam casting harsh shadows on the walls. The diner was back to how it had been before the power outage, and the couple in booth 4 was there, sipping their coffee and cutting into their pancakes. They looked up, confusion in their eyes, but then they quickly returned to their meal, as if nothing had happened. I stared at them, my mind reeling. Had I imagined the entire ordeal? Was I losing my grip on reality? I tried to speak, but my voice was a whisper, barely audible, even to myself. I approached the couple, my hands shaking, but they ignored me, their focus entirely on their breakfast. I turned to the door, but it was unlocked now. I could leave if I wanted to, but something held me back. The diner felt like a trap, a place where the normal rules no longer applied. I made my way back to the counter, my mind a jumble of thoughts. The emergency light flickered, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I tried the phone again, but it was still dead. I checked the kitchen once more, but the cooks were there, working as if nothing had happened. The diner was back to its usual state, but the sense of dread remained, a constant companion. I returned to the couple, my resolve hardening. I needed to know what had happened, to understand the inexplicable, but as I approached the booth they looked up, and their eyes were empty, devoid of any recognition. I backed away, my heart pounding. The diner was a living nightmare, and I was its sole witness. The lights flickered again, and I braced myself for the inevitable. This time, when they went out, I didn't scream. I knew what was coming, and I was determined to face it. The darkness enveloped me, and I waited, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. When the lights came back on, the diner was exactly as it had been before, and the couple was still there, their expressions unchanged. I tried to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. The diner seemed to have a life of its own, a malevolent presence that wasn't about to let me go. I tried to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence was deafening, and the diner felt like a prison, an inescapable trap. The couple continued their meal, and the cooks in the kitchen worked with mechanical precision. The diner was a microcosm of normalcy, but it was all a facade. I knew something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. The diner was a puzzle, and I was the only one who could see the pieces out of place. I tried to focus, to make sense of the chaos, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The lights flickered once more, and I knew it was the end. When they came back on, the diner was empty again. The couple and the cooks vanished without a trace. The food on the table was cold now, the steam having dissipated, and the diner felt colder, more lifeless than ever. I tried the door, and it opened this time. I stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome relief. The streets were still empty, and the neon signs flickered weakly. I walked away from the diner, my heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. The diner was a place of darkness, and I had been its captive. As I turned the corner, I glanced back, and the diner was still there, the lights on, the sign welcoming customers, but the sense of dread remained, a lingering presence that followed me into the night. I never went back, but the diner stayed with me, a constant reminder of the night when the ordinary became the terrifying, and the familiar turned into a nightmare. I was on a late shift at the control tower, the kind where you pray the monotony will pass quickly. It was a routine night, or so I thought, until the transmission came through, breaking the silence with a static-laden whisper. I reached for the headset, my heart thudding in my chest. The transmission was distorted, a garbled mix of voices and static. It sounded like it was coming from a long way off, yet the urgency in the tone was undeniable. I fiddled with the controls, trying to clear the interference, but it only grew more pronounced. The voice became clearer, though no less unsettling. It was a pilot, or so I assumed, identifying an aircraft. The call sign was unfamiliar, and the frequency was one that shouldn't have been used for decades. Something about the voice sent a chill down my spine, a sensation I couldn't quite place. I relayed the information to the team, and we cross-referenced the call sign. It took a few moments, but when the answer came back, it was like a punch to the gut. The aircraft had crashed into the sea 20 years ago, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of all on board. The wreckage was never found, and the incident had long been consigned to the annals of aviation disasters. Yet here was a transmission, alive and urgent, as if the plane had never gone down. We were trained to handle emergencies, but this was something else entirely. I cleared the runway, my hands trembling slightly as I issued the landing instructions. The runway lights flickered on, casting a cold, clinical glow across the tarmac. The aircraft descended, its engines whining in a way that seemed out of place. It touched down, the landing gear screeching as it made contact with the runway. The noise was grating, a sound that lingered in my ears even after the plane had come to a stop. Security responded quickly, their vehicles racing towards the aircraft with lights and sirens. I watched from the control tower, my eyes glued to the monitors as the team approached the plane. The aircraft sat on the runway, its exterior glistening with what looked like moisture. The doors remained closed and the engines were eerily silent. The security team circled the plane, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I could see them through the cameras, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. One of the officers opened the main door, and a wave of damp air hit the tarmac, mingling with the cold night. The interior of the plane was pitch black, and I strained to see inside. The officer stepped onto the plane, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The beam revealed an empty cabin, the seats stripped bare, and the floor covered in seaweed. The air inside was thick with the salty tang of the ocean, an aroma that seemed out of place on a dry runway. The security team continued their investigation, their flashlights sweeping across the cabin. They found no signs of life, no passengers, no crew, only the damp, seaweed-covered interior. The air traffic control tower was abuzz with chatter, but I was frozen, my eyes fixed on the monitors. The plane should not have been there, should not have been flying, should not have been transmitting, yet it had, and now it sat on the runway, a ghost from the past. The security team returned to their vehicles, their faces pale and shaken. They reported back to the tower, their voices low and tense. The plane was empty, they said, but the seats showed signs of recent occupancy. The seaweed was fresh, and there were wet footprints leading to the cockpit. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the kind that starts at the base of your neck and spreads through your entire body. I decided to see for myself, unable to shake the feeling that something was very off. I descended from the control tower, the night air wrapping around me like a shroud. The plane loomed ahead, a monolith of metal and mystery. As I approached, the sense of dread grew. I could hear the muffled whispers of the security team, their voices tinged with fear. I climbed the steps to the plane, my flashlight in hand. The interior was as described, empty, damp, and covered in seaweed. The footprints led me to the cockpit, and I paused, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The cockpit was eerily intact, the instruments showing signs of recent use. The pilot's seats were empty, but there was a dampness around them, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago. I turned to leave, my nerves frayed, but something caught my eye. A note tucked into the dashboard, written in a hand that seemed both familiar and foreign. The words were simple, yet they sent a jolt through me. We never left. My heart raced, and I stumbled back, my flashlight beam wavering as I tried to make sense of it. I rushed back to the control tower, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. I reported what I had found, but the others were skeptical. A note, they said, could have been planted. A prank, perhaps, or an elaborate hoax. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was real. The investigation began, a team of experts descending on the plane to uncover its secrets. I watched from a distance, unable to tear my eyes away. The plane was examined from top to bottom, but no further clues were found. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing that could explain how it had flown or who had been on board. The plane was eventually towed away, its empty, seaweed-filled interior a grim reminder of the unsolved mystery. I returned to my post, my mind still reeling. The transmission, the plane, the note, all of it seemed to defy explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had opened a door we shouldn't have, that we had invited something dark and unknown into our world. The days that followed were a blur. The authorities conducted interviews, and I recounted the events to them, though the words seemed hollow, inadequate to capture the terror I had felt. The plane was never flown again, and its fate remained a mystery. The incident was filed away, another bizarre and unexplained occurrence in the annals of aviation, but the memories stayed with me, a knot in my stomach that refused to untie. I couldn't shake the image of that empty cockpit, the dampness, the seaweed, the note. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, a fluke, but deep down I knew it was more than that. The plane had returned, and with it a darkness that I couldn't fully comprehend. I still work at the control tower, but the night shifts are the worst. The darkness seems to close in, and the silence is deafening. I can't help but think about what might be out there, waiting, watching. The thought of that plane, its empty seats and the damp seaweed-filled cabin haunts me. I know it should have stayed lost in the sea, but something had brought it back, and I couldn't help but wonder what else might be lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for its turn to return. The runway lights still flicker on and off, casting a cold, sterile glow. I keep a watchful eye, my nerves on edge, knowing that any moment the static might crackle through the headset again, and the ghostly whispers of the past might return to haunt us once more. The night is long and the silence is thick, but I can't escape the feeling that we are not alone. I was alone in the booth, the only soul for miles, the silence punctuated only by the occasional car passing through. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m., and my shift was dragging on. My eyes were heavy, but I couldn't afford to doze off, not here, not in the dead of night. A car appeared on the monitor, headlights slicing through the darkness. It looked ordinary, a family sedan, nothing to raise suspicion. I leaned forward, ready to greet them, to take their money, to let them pass into the night. But as I turned away for just a moment to adjust the lighting in the booth, I glanced back at the screen. The car was gone. The road was empty, as if it had never been there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the image didn't change. The road remained barren, the night as quiet as ever. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I must have been imagining things. But the feeling lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. I checked the logs, the cameras, everything. No sign of a car, no record of a transaction. It was as if the vehicle had slipped through the cracks of reality itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply amiss. A few days later, I found a newspaper article about a family who had disappeared a few weeks back. They had been on their way to visit relatives, a simple journey that should have taken no more than a few hours, but they never arrived. The car was found overturned in a river, not far from the toll booth I manned. The details were grim, the story unsettling. The family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their overturned vehicle and a trail of questions. I couldn't help but think about the car I had seen on my monitor. It matched the description in the article, down to the model and the colour. The coincidence was too much to ignore. I found myself looking over my shoulder more frequently, my eyes constantly darting to the road, half expecting to see that car again, but the nights remained quiet, and no other vehicles seemed out of the ordinary. The days passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a fluke, a glitch in the system, a trick of the light. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more the doubts crept in. The toll booth felt different, the air colder, the shadows longer. I started to notice other things too, a rustling in the bushes, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One night I felt a presence behind me, a breath on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The booth was empty, save for me. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, but the feeling didn't fade. It was as if the toll booth itself was alive, watching me, waiting for something to happen. The next night, I saw it again. The car appeared on the monitor, just as it had before. I watched, heart pounding, as it approached the booth. I reached for the cash drawer, my hands trembling. But when I looked back, the car was gone. The road was empty, the night as still as a tomb. I checked the logs once more, but there was nothing. No record, no trace, just the lingering chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I decided to tell my supervisor about what had been happening. He listened, his expression blank, and then suggested I take a few days off. Maybe I was just tired, he said. Maybe I needed a break from the long nights. I thanked him and left, but the relief was short-lived. The car followed me home, a silent witness to my every move. It parked at the end of my street, headlights off, the windows tinted. I couldn't see inside, but I knew it was there. The nights grew colder, the darkness deeper. I noticed the car more frequently, always in the background, always just out of reach. I tried to ignore it, to go about my life as if nothing were amiss. But the car was a constant reminder, a silent spectre that haunted my every step. I began to research the toll booth, digging through old newspapers and online archives. The more I read, the more I realized that the toll booth had a dark history. Over the years, several cars had disappeared, families gone without a trace. Some had been found, like the one in the river, but most had vanished entirely, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. I felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that I couldn't shake. The toll booth wasn't just a place of employment, it was a gateway to something far more sinister. I knew I had to leave, to get away from the place before it consumed me. But every time I thought about quitting, the car appeared again, a silent warning that I couldn't escape. One night I decided to confront the car. I drove to the toll booth, parked my car, and waited. The road was empty, the night as quiet as a grave, but after a few minutes the car appeared on the monitor. I watched as it approached, feeling a mix of fear and determination. When it reached the booth, I stepped out, my heart racing. The car was just a few feet away, the windows dark and impenetrable. I couldn't see the driver, but I could feel their presence. The air around me seemed to still, the world holding its breath. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The car was locked, and I had no way of getting inside. I stood there, frozen, as the car began to move. It drove away slowly at first, then picking up speed. I ran to my car, started the engine, and followed. The road twisted and turned, the car ahead of me never faltering. I lost sight of it as it took a sharp turn, but I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. When I reached the river, the car was nowhere to be seen. I searched the area, but there was no sign of it. The river was still, the water black and impenetrable. I couldn't shake the feeling that the car had plunged into the depths just as the others had before it. I returned home, the fear gnawing at me. I knew I had to make a decision, to leave the toll booth or face whatever was waiting for me. But as I lay in bed, the darkness pressing in, I heard a sound, a soft rattle, like a key in a lock. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked towards the door. It opened slowly, the hinges creaking. The car was in my driveway, the engine running. I couldn't see the driver, but I knew they were there. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my hands shaking. I should have run, should have called for help. But I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to think. The car approached the house, the headlights illuminating the path. I watched, helpless, as it parked in front of the door. The engine cut off, and the world fell silent. I waited, breath held, for the driver to emerge, but no one did. The car sat there, a silent sentinel, a harbinger of the darkness to come. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I grabbed my keys and ran, the night air cold against my skin. I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I was miles away. I found a motel, checked in, and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep, just lay in the darkness, listening to the silence. The next morning I returned to the toll booth to quit my job. My supervisor was surprised to see me, but he accepted my resignation without question. I handed over my keys, my uniform, and walked away from the place that had haunted me for so long. But as I stepped outside, I saw it. The car was parked in the lot, the engine running. I didn't hesitate. I ran to my car and drove away, the fear driving me faster than I had ever driven before. I kept driving, not knowing where I was going, just needing to put distance between myself and the toll booth. But no matter how far I went, the car was always there, just a few cars behind me, a constant reminder of what I'd left behind. I don't know where I am now or what the future holds. I just keep driving, the car always following, always watching. I can't shake the feeling that it's leading me somewhere, to a place I don't want to go. But I have no choice. The car is my shadow, my fate, and I can't escape it. The road stretches out before me, endless and dark. The car is always there, always just a little bit behind. I can't help but wonder what lies ahead, what horrors await me in the darkness. But I can't stop, can't turn back. The car is my guide, my tormentor, and I am its prisoner. I don't know when this will end or if it will ever end. All I know is that I am alone and the car is always there. The night is endless, the road is long, and the car is waiting.